All right, can you see my screen? Let's see some nods or thumbs or anything. Yes, perfect, great. So thank you to the organizers for inviting me virtually inviting me to talk about this paper, which is joint work with Alex Oettl and Christian Catalini and was part of my dissertation. And as the title already says, we're going to be looking at co-working in close proximity and focusing on peer learning and startup performance outcomes. Specifically what this paper is about, or what we're trying to do with this paper, is to further our understanding about the relationship between physical proximity and knowledge transfer outside the traditional boundaries of the firm. So this is important to keep in mind. We're not looking within a firm, but between firms. And this has been notoriously difficult to examine, given a lack of micro level data and also the non-random placement of firms. But what we do know in general so far is that the diffusion of ideas is highly localized, or appears to be so, and that especially the more tacit know-how is transferred by face-to-face interactions between individuals, which points towards the importance of actually being close together. And there's also a host of research that is supporting this with empirical findings, and indicates that the extent to which physical proximity explains information flows can really depend on as little as a few hundred meters. And here I borrowed this from Bill Kerr, so credit where credit is due. These two papers really nicely show how the effects of distance kind of decay very quickly with as little as 700 meters or even 1 to 5 miles. So these are different papers that show this. But while physical proximity is one of the more salient characteristics of distance that affects knowledge exchange, there are also other distances that can facilitate or impede knowledge transfer and exchange. One is the social, the other is the knowledge space, and the product market dimensions. So these have been shown to both like kind of promote the desire or also the ability to exchange knowledge. But we don't really know how these interplay with physical proximity. So do these augment the value of geographic proximity, or do they diminish the value of physical proximity? And so in this paper, what we're going to explore is precisely these relationships. So our first prediction is really more based, it's almost a replication of what we know, is that physical proximity will have a positive influence on peer learning. And the other prediction we have is that social and the physical proximity, that these dimensions seem to actually be more substitutes, because people who are, or firms that are similar in the social dimension anyways, are likely to interact no matter what, and the physical may not really help that much more. In terms of knowledge space, we predict that this will be a U-shaped relationship, given that if you are completely different and have no knowledge overlap at all, it's going to be hard to share or learn from each other. But if you completely overlap, even if you're close, you're not really going to learn much more. In terms of product market, it could go in any way. So it could be precisely because you're close, you can't keep up these barriers of knowledge flowing and spillovers. So because you're close, you're going to share more. Or it could be because you're close, you're going to try even harder to stop people from learning from each other. So this is what these are the ideas we're going into this project with. The context, we believe, is a very relevant and important one, because we're looking at learning among nascent firms. And we think this is particularly important because, or given findings that indicate that learning from fellow entrepreneurs is especially important. And this is even more crucial given that entrepreneurs operate in fast-paced and uncertain environments, which makes local search and these really frequent adjustments and experimentation especially important. And from this, what we think is that simply being close to other entrepreneurs facing similar problems may reduce these costs of accessing relevant information because they can see it from other firms and or can learn it from the others by being in the same space. All right, to give you a preview of the results in case anyone has to leave earlier or I don't finish on time, what we do find is that the physical dimension has a positive impact on peer learning, and I'll show you in a moment how we do that. We also find that the social proximity and physical proximity seem to be substitutes. In terms of knowledge space, we also see this U-shaped relationship. And in terms of product market dimensions, we also find, similar to the social dimension, that these seem to be substitutes. In addition, we also find that common spaces seem to extend the effect of proximity. This finding, I think, is very fascinating because we could apply this also to virtual spaces. Interaction amongst proximate firms is a viable mechanism, and I'll show you in a moment how we actually get at that. And we also find that learning from proximate firms has implications for firm performance. So it's not just that it's easier to learn from them, but this is also helping you achieve certain startup milestones. All right, so where do we get all these findings from? Let me briefly explain the context and the data that's underlying this study. So we got this information from, back then, it was the 4th largest co-working space in the USA. And here, entrepreneurs or startups are allocated to 4 different floors. There are about 200 rooms, and our observation span about 30 months. The average age of the startups is about a year. Here we have the characteristics of the rooms. We also looked at business models and also the gender composition of the companies. Female equal to 1 is if there is a female in the startup. And we also looked at their technology usage and if they had received any very highly visible award. And the way we measure learning is using web technology adoption. And the reason we did that is because the startups in our sample are primarily software and online-based startups. So for them, technology usage is extremely important and can be seen, well, it has, and the decision which technology you use also has long-term consequences. It's fairly path dependent. And the interesting thing of the data we use, we can see exactly when they started using it and when they stopped using a certain technology. The data we got from BuiltWith, and just to give you an idea what this means, web technologies, I picked the top runners or in the subcategory of error tracking. And here on the left with the B, this is Bugsnag. This is used by Airbnb, Lyft, MailChimp. In the middle, we see Honey Badger, which is used by eBay, NetSanity, and Kickstarter. And on the right, we have Rollbar, which is used by Salesforce, Uber, and Kayak. So it's not apparent why you would use one or the other. You really have to learn this from others and understand how this fits the needs of your specific startup. In terms of the empirical approach, so our analysis on the startup dyad level on the same floor. And here we estimate the effect of distance on the count of technologies firm I adopts from firm J that firm J had already adopted. So this is really important to keep in mind. We also look at the probability that firm I adopts the technology firm J has already used. And just to give you the estimation, X is, or Y is the web technology adoption measure I just explained to you. X is a vector of dyad-specific controls. And then I include firm I times room fixed effects, as well as firm J times room fixed effects here. Now, naturally, as I already mentioned, there are really big concerns in terms of endogeneity when it comes to looking at proximity, firm location choice, et cetera, and also in the context of peer learning. And to address these concerns, we rely on the natural random room assignment of these startups in the co-working space. And we also follow recent work and produce dyadic robust standard errors to make sure that it's not because of the specific neighborhood you're in what we're finding. So in terms of room assignment, lucky for us, we were able to, even when we regress dyad-specific characteristics on distance, there doesn't seem to be an impact. So this was a sanity check for us. In terms of physical proximity, and I'm just for purpose of brevity, just going to show you the graphs. What we see is that those that are very close, there's a strong impact of proximity on technology adoption. And I really want to stress that our emitted variable is a different floor. So what you're seeing here is that if you aren't very close, so within 20 meters, this is what our first quartile is capturing, you may as well be in a different floor. So I think this is a very strong and important result. For robustness, we also did a randomized inference, or used a randomized randomization inference method to check that this isn't just like, you know, some spurious correlations that we're finding. And we used the Monte Carlo simulation and randomized closeness between each dyad and estimated the likelihood of adopting a technology as a function of closeness. Again, lucky for us, we found that only 2 of the simulated draws had a coefficient greater than the point estimate we had, which equals a randomized inference p-value of 0.002. Now, in terms of the interplay of other proximity dimensions, I already highlighted these before, but just so that you can see what we actually did. We measured social proximity looking at if firms had both a very salient characteristic that only a minority of the firms in the co-working space had. This is if they're majority female, or both have are successful, so have received a very visible award. In terms of knowledge space, we looked at their pre-period technology overlap. And for product market proximity, we looked at their industry and business models and if they have the same ones. What we find here is that, as I mentioned, there's a negative interaction between close and both social dimensions, as we can see here in columns 1 and 2. Columns 3 shows the product market dimension. Also, the interaction is negative. And importantly, what I really want to stress here is the composite index of being completely different provides the flipped around impact. So here the interaction is positive, which suggests that those that benefit the most from being close are those firms that are very different from each other. In terms of knowledge space, I already mentioned that we find this U-shaped relationship. So those that have a fairly low, but not zero overlap in terms of technology are those, again, that seem to benefit the most from being physically close. And I already mentioned plausible mechanisms. Here, what we thought of, like I mentioned before, is this really interpersonal interaction that's going on. And one way we could look at that was to find places with a heightened likelihood of individuals engaging in conversation. And here we exploit a joint event, a lunch, that takes place every Friday at this co-working space, and look how physical proximity affects the likelihood of attending these events and in what order people check into this lunch. And as we can see here, we find that proximity increases the joint attendance, the number and the likelihood of attending an event. And conditionally on jointly attending an event, it also increases the event check-in line proximity, as you can see here, within 1 person to 5 people, whereas within 10 and 25 people serve as our placebo tests, so to speak. In terms of performance, and apologies for going over this really quickly. In interest of time, I will not spend too much time on the logic of the instrument, but both using OLS and IV estimation approaches, where the instrument is the predicted probability of adopting a technology from a proximate firm, we find that proximity or adopting has a positive impact on achieving seed funding and also funding over $1 million. So to summarize, what we find is that close proximity greatly influences the likelihood of adopting an upstream production technology, also used by a peer firm. This effect decays really quickly. So after 20 meters, there doesn't seem to be any influence. And then more importantly, it's like for all those that are a little further than 20 meters, it's like they're on a different floor. Our results also suggest that the interplay with other proximity dimensions changes the effective distance. So this is important to keep in mind when we're engineering these communities and spaces. And interaction with peers is a viable mechanism driving our results. And the findings also suggest that technology adoption from proximate peers contributes to achieving these important startup performance milestones. And to summarize, I'm going to use a quote from a CEO of a graduating startup at this co-working space, who mentioned, "We are so thankful for our time at the co-working hub. We started off as a small team in the office and all working like crazy to try and build a product that customers would see the value of and want to use. We found many companies that we could learn from, and were able to establish some key relationships that provided timely advice, and these relationships directly contributed to the significant growth of our startup." So, taken together, this paper informs our understanding of the scale at which peer learning among small entrepreneurial firms takes place, which is very small. We highlight important nuances in terms of the benefits from physical proximity depending on other structural, social, knowledge-based, and competition-related dimensions. And importantly, we detect that physical proximity is most crucial for supporting learning amongst firms that are otherwise distant. And where physical structure may lay the groundwork for exchange to take place, other factors may actually determine how firms enact on these presented opportunities. And who knows, maybe this will also help us figure out how to make virtual co-working spaces more effective. So thank you. I think I'm on time, and I really appreciate your comments later on, and I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Maria. Our next speaker will be Deepak Somaya, and I remind you that we can use the chat room to share comments. At the end of the discussant's presentation, if we have time, we will be able to do Q&A. So Deepak, it's all yours.
Thank you, Gwen. I hope everyone can hear me all right. I'm going to start sharing my slides now. So I want to thank Daniel for putting together this wonderful panel. I think the papers are so nicely related to each other. In fact, I can jump off directly by connecting to Maria's paper in a minute, so I will do that. But let me first sort of introduce the paper more generally. This is a paper on external knowledge sourcing, so knowledge sourcing from other firms, and barriers to employee mobility. So we have a somewhat paradoxical take on that, and I'll explain that in a minute as well. First, I should acknowledge my co-author, Eunkwang So. Eunkwang is a doctoral student here at Illinois. He's on the job market this year as well. This is a paper from outside his dissertation. He's on this call, and that's a picture in case you want to find him. Also, I'll echo Gwen's point about posting questions in chat. I have the luxury of having Eunkwang sort of to answer questions as we go along, if you need to. Also happy to answer the questions later myself. All right, so this paper really takes a look at how employee mobility barriers may affect external knowledge sourcing. And what we mean by external knowledge sourcing here is a firm building on external knowledge in its own internal innovation. And just to highlight how we're going to measure it, we're going to measure it by the citation of external patents. So compared to Maria's paper, for example, this is a paper that sort of takes a much more macro view at learning from other firms, if you will. So one of the things that we know from especially the open innovation literature is that learning from other firms, the outside-in part of open innovation, is something that helps firms innovate quite significantly as well. And we're trying to connect that to mobility barriers, right? So mobility barriers you could think about as frictions in labor markets that might be given exogenously that prevent workers from easily moving between companies. We're going to focus here on R&D workers, but also keep in mind that while they might be exogenously provided in certain contexts, and particularly when we do empirical work, we like this exogeneity. This could also be a strategic variable that companies could choose. They could choose to sort of try to make their workers more sticky and make it more difficult for them to move. So we specifically in this case use non-competes as an example. A number of you might be familiar with what non-competes are. There are clauses essentially in labor contracts that specify which companies, which regions or jobs or technical fields an employee may move to, and even sort of time periods within which they may move. So even if these employees leave the company, they're sort of prohibited by law through these non-competes from moving to other firms. And in particular, this can be a type of mobility barrier. And we're going to leverage some quasi-exogenous variation in these mobility barriers to actually test our theory. Now, if I were to guess, most of you are probably thinking, well, if there's barriers to employee mobility, then probably what that does is it reduces the extent of external knowledge sourcing. And so this is certainly the received view. And this is sort of the suggestion. The reason that the received view is this, and the reason that the literature suggests that employee mobility barriers may limit external knowledge sourcing, is because we widely believe that mobile employees sort of play a key role in knowledge spillovers between firms. Given that knowledge is very often quite tacit, difficult to learn, when employees actually move, they're much more effective at transferring knowledge. And so that's certainly true. And so the expectation here might be that mobility barriers will decrease external knowledge sourcing. But let me use Maria's very nice paper to illustrate the point we're trying to make, right? So it's also true that there are many other ways in which knowledge might spill over between firms, right? So there could be various kinds of alliances, collaboration. Firms could choose what areas to focus on in terms of R&D. There may be customers or suppliers through which they interact. There may be all kinds of informal interactions of the type that Maria was describing. Some of this might happen in the field. Some of this might happen through scientific publication. And so just to take her example, imagine these firms are in this co-working space. And if the firms are constantly worried that their employees are going to move to competing firms within that co-working space, what do you think is going to happen to the knowledge spillovers between those firms, right? They're actually going to avoid trying to, at least the management of those firms are going to try to impede the interaction between the employees. And they're going to sort of try to ensure that there's less knowledge spillovers, because they're worried that that interaction between the employees might then become a mechanism through which they might lose their own talent. And that's the approach that we're going to take in this paper. In fact, it was the hypothesis that we sort of started with. And you might see from the structure of the paper that we actually just go all in on that hypothesis, although one could imagine that one can sort of think about this paper also as a competing hypothesis paper. But we're actually going to focus on just that alternative hypothesis here. So the key to this alternative theoretical mechanism is that external knowledge sourcing may increase the risk of losing valuable human capital. And we think that this might be true for at least two reasons. One is the more that you build as a firm on knowledge within the field more generally, what happens to the talent of your employees, the human capital of your employees, is that it becomes more general, right? In the Becker sense of firm specific versus general. So these employees now are more employable at other firms and therefore more valuable to other firms. And so there's a higher risk of losing them. But also, just as importantly, one of the things that would likely happen by building on other firms' knowledge is that it reduces the information frictions in the labor market. So the actual actions that employees might undertake in order to learn from other firms and to use external knowledge might itself decrease information frictions. So they might actually sort of interact through informal mechanisms or even through formal mechanisms such as alliances and so on. So that might decrease the information frictions right there. But in addition, the type of knowledge that they're building on makes it easier for other employers to actually evaluate them. So if you have an employee that's building significantly on the knowledge of a particular firm, it becomes harder for external agents to actually evaluate these employees. And so there's a higher sort of level of information friction in the labor market. But if you're building on others' knowledge, it's easier to say, this person is talented in the space or not so talented in the space, et cetera. So there's one other little tweak here, which is that we expect that this kind of effect that we just hypothesized, that mobility barriers are going to impede knowledge spillovers or external knowledge sourcing, that this is likely to be localized. And this localized effect is likely to happen for two reasons. One has to do with the localized nature of employee mobility more generally, right? So you're more worried about your employees moving to more local firms, so you're therefore more concerned about sourcing knowledge from more local firms. Okay, so this is a well-established fact, and I don't need to belabor the point too much. The other, which connects with how we're actually going to measure employee mobility barriers, is related to non-competes. And non-competes, as it turns out, are governed by state law. And so more local moves are much more effectively impeded by stronger non-competes, and moves between states are less likely to be impeded by them. There may be some effect, but nonetheless, it's a significantly smaller effect. And so for both of these reasons, we expect that there's going to be a localized effect, which leads to our main hypothesis, which is that an increase in mobility barriers, which we measure as the enforceability of non-compete agreements, will increase the extent to which firms innovate by building on local external knowledge. And then we explore two other mechanisms that I won't go into great detail about, but primarily just state them and highlight the role that they play here. The first one is whether firms essentially the strategy that they take to their human capital, whether it's one of building their own human capital or instead acquiring the human capital from other firms. So we particularly like this hypothesis, which is a moderating hypothesis, because it helps discriminate between the two plausible mechanisms here, right? So if you're worried about losing employees, you're more likely to be worried about that if you are a human capital builder as a firm, and less if you're a human capital acquirer. On the other hand, if you're essentially sourcing knowledge by acquiring employees from other firms, that's your sort of primus modus operandi, then the effect's going to be in the opposite direction. So if our theory or our proposed mechanism is right, then the positive impact of employee mobility on positive impact of employee mobility barriers on a firm's propensity to innovate by building on local external knowledge, that is likely to be greater for firms who innovate by relying more on internally developed human capital. And then we also look at other appropriability mechanisms. So one of the interesting features of our paper is that it connects to a small but growing literature on some of the potential downsides of knowledge sourcing and open innovation more generally. Generally, people focus on other appropriability mechanisms or appropriability mechanisms more generally as one of the ways that you can mitigate those downsides. So in our case as well, if you're concerned about employees moving, and if appropriability mechanisms other than non-competes, the barriers to employee mobility here, prevent some of the harm that could occur as a result of employee mobility. And in addition, it could also, in fact, Martin, our discussant, has done some nice work showing that other types of appropriability mechanisms, such as patents or other types of IP enforcement, might actually diminish the extent to which employees might actually move. And so if that is true, then the concerns about employee mobility that firms might have might actually be lower. And so again, we are also proposing that this effect that we're expecting, our main effect, that's going to be greater in industries where these other mechanisms are actually weaker. So there's a substitutive mechanism here from other employee mobility barriers, from other appropriability mechanisms. So in terms of our research design, we leverage what people call the Michigan non-compete experiment. This is something that a stream of work that started with Matt Marks and colleagues in 2009, but a number of other people have also built on this, and essentially leverages a somewhat unexpected change in 1985 of the enforceability of non-competes in the state of Michigan, where this enforceability was strengthened by the passage of an antitrust reform act. So the act itself was not directly focused on non-competes, hence the somewhat stronger claim of plausible exogeneity. And what we do essentially is to leverage that change in Michigan and compare it to a bunch of other comparison states. So our sample and our data, we observe or we measure all our variables at the firm level, although we'll also talk about patent level measures a little bit later in terms of our robustness checks. But essentially, we identify about 190 publicly traded firms in Michigan and the control states, we do need to measure a number of things about these firms. And so we end up with a smaller number of firms at the end of the day. But it turns out these firms actually have more than 50% of the patents that are involved. And we also, in our patent sample, go beyond these 190 firms. So we're looking at a 5-year window on either side of that change in Michigan, and use a number of different sources of data to operationalize this. I won't go into the measures and instead sort of jump to our sort of primary methodology here, which, as you might expect, is a diff and diff approach. And essentially, our approach is to look at the change in this law in Michigan that's measured by that post-1985 measure, a dummy variable, and then compare that to comparison states. And then our moderating variables are essentially interactions on that difference estimator. So just to give you a little bit of a preview of what might be happening here in the data, this particular graph tracks the average percentage of local external citations, the blue line being Michigan and the red line being the other comparison or control states. And you'll see that there's sort of a fairly parallel track before 1985. And then after that, the Michigan line sort of goes much more closer to the comparison states. We don't quite see the same effect in non-local external citations. So, and the third category would be self-citations, by the way, here. So, and this is sort of consistent with our hypothesis, right, that there should be a localized effect based on our theory. So in our main results, we actually do find this effect in the direction that we hypothesize, that these mobility barriers actually increase external knowledge sourcing. The effect is about 28% over the baseline level, so it's a not insignificant change. We also find, consistent with the hypothesis that tests our mechanism, so to speak, that firms that are human capital acquirers are less likely to be affected by this, and therefore firms that are human capital builders are more likely to be affected. And for those firms, the effect is almost 40%. And in fact, as you go towards the human capital acquisition end of things, the effect essentially goes away. And then also firms that have access to other appropriability mechanisms are less likely to be affected by this. And again, the firms that have essentially no or very weak appropriability mechanisms outside of the mobility barriers, for those firms, the effect is as high as 60%, as compared to that 28% on average. Okay, so there are a large number of robustness tests that we have done for this paper. The two that I will highlight, you can read the rest if there's time to go through that really quickly. One is we also use changes in other state-level non-compete laws after 2000. And one of the advantages of using that time period also is that we can exclude examiner-added citations. Right? And so we find essentially the same results using that data. And also keep in mind that our mechanism here in this paper is that firms can source knowledge through a bunch of other mechanisms and not just through employee mobility. And these other mechanisms are more likely to be used if there are employee mobility barriers in place. So we explored one of these other mechanisms through which external knowledge sourcing might occur, for which we have reasonably good data. And that's to look at alliance formation between firms. And particularly if our theory is correct, we should see this effect in local alliances. And so we find that MARA sort of both increases the likelihood of local alliances that's within Michigan and the number of those local alliances. And then there's a whole bunch of other tests that we do, including, as I mentioned earlier, patent level tests and some of the R&D riskiness measures that Conti uses, for example, and so on and so forth. All right. So with that, and there's a whole bunch of limitations nonetheless, I will not go into those, and I'll skip them for now and jump to contributions and conclusions here. So I think one of the interesting things in our paper is that we re-examine what we might think of as the relationship between mobility barriers and knowledge sourcing. And we have both theory and evidence that sort of challenges the conventional wisdom on this. I will highlight that we're doing this for established firms. So the story might be somewhat different, especially when we think about spin-out formation. Also, what we highlight here is that knowledge sourcing is related to potential employee mobility. And so there might be some drawbacks of open innovation, which in prior research is largely centered on appropriation of the rents from this innovation. But we're also sort of highlighting here a downside that involves human capital loss from open innovation. And then we can also sort of connect here human capital strategies or mobility barriers that come about due to human capital strategies and firms' innovation strategies, and the idea that if you have more control over employee mobility, this might facilitate more open innovation by firms. And last but not least, we also show the interplay between different appropriability mechanisms. So other appropriability mechanisms may actually substitute for non-competes or employee mobility barriers in constraining mobility and or its adverse effects. So let me conclude here. I think I'm just about on time. And we look forward to questions, both in chat and also afterwards.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Deepak. Our next speaker is Ines.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you so much to the organizers. I'm hoping that you can see my slides by now. Thank you so much to the organizers for including our paper here. This is joint work with Sharique, Hasan, and Koning. So jumping really quickly into the motivation. So this paper came about really from the observation that a lot of people in our networks have not acquired their jobs through applying for them. And we started thinking about whether that is something that is a recent trend that is increasing in the labor market, and whether it's something that we should pay attention to more closely. And so what we found is that, first of all, we know from the literature that finding and retaining talent is a really important task and a costly task for firms. But we also know from a really long stretch of literature all the way to the 80s that when we think of how workers and firms match, we tend to think of workers initiating. I mean, of course, the firm posts a job, but the worker or the prospective worker initiates the movement by applying to that job. And so this, of course, implies that workers are searching for jobs, but we have some recent evidence that tells us this is from last year, or early last year, 2020, some recent figures from the Fed telling us that 1 in 3 job switches actually come from workers that were not looking for jobs. And so this got us thinking, well, if that is the case, then how are firms hiring nowadays that permits these statistics that actually don't match the model of prospective workers applying for jobs? We started thinking about what could impact these trends. And so we found 2 main important recent trends in the labor market that can help us try to start tackling this question. One is, of course, digitization. And this is something that is not new to anybody, especially after a year like the one we've had. But what digitization does is it makes workers and firm job postings much more visible. So both workers can see a lot more job postings, and therefore that decreases their cost of applying. This has been studied quite extensively in the past 2 decades. But on the other hand, what it also does is make workers more visible to firms. And we know much less about how that has changed how firms hire. So our question here really is, do these trends change how firms hire, and potentially then see, well, what impact does that have in worker-firm matching, and of course in firm performance? Now, I should be completely clear that we are not getting at firm performance in this specific paper. In this paper, we're trying to document the phenomenon of firm-driven hiring. And by firm-driven hiring, what I mean is this hunting, is this the firm proactively looking for workers as opposed to waiting for workers to apply to their open jobs. Okay, so what's the evidence that we provide here? We don't have causal evidence as of now. What we do in this paper really is hinge on a theoretical model, which unfortunately, for the sake of time, I won't have time to go into details about, but I will tell you the main predictions that come from that model. And so we hinge on the predictions from that model and we test them with two different sets of data, one that was constructed by us from a survey, and the other one from Burning Glass Technologies, which gives us a very large sample of HR job postings in the US. So with these two data sets, we hope to provide evidence of a new trend, or at least an increasing trend, if not new, of firms hunting for talent, and when and which firms seem to benefit more from this hunting mechanism. So in our labor market model, we look at two sectors, so high skill and low skill. And the main idea of the model is that strong skill complementarity, or if you will, a strong dependence on highly technical skills will grant hunting for talent more benefit for that firm. And at the same time, if the cost of reviewing incoming applications is particularly high for a firm or for an industry, be it because they have too many applications, or because exactly they are looking for a very specific type of skill set, and therefore each application will need to be reviewed much more carefully. This also increases the likelihood of firms wanting to engage in hunting for talent. And so, as I was saying, we use these two data sets. One is a comprehensive representative is what I meant, representative survey over the US working population to see how they got their jobs in 2020. Mind you, this was right before COVID hit. We have done a follow-up survey that has not changed the numbers that I will show you today, but the numbers that I'm showing you today are really about a year ago-ish. And yeah, and finally then we complement with more historical data on the Burning Glass Technology job postings for HR. And hopefully I'll have time to explain both. So let me go really quickly into the predictions that come from the model. So as I said, we have a theoretical model that tries to rationalize a behavior of firms. So we completely take the firm side approach here. And we try to rationalize the behavior of firms where they have two choices. They can hire their workers through outbound recruiting, or another way of saying this is the hunting for talent. And that means they need to spend resources looking for potential right candidates for the jobs they're looking for, or they can not engage in that activity and just wait for applications to come in. And so what our comparative statistics predicts is that profitability of outbound recruiting will increase with firms binding skill requirements. So another way of saying this is for firms that require, for the job postings they're looking, that require very high technical skills or very specific technical skills, meaning they would want a sort of an off-the-shelf solution and hire someone that has the exact experience they're needing. Then we expect from the model tells us that higher skilled sectors should rely more on outbound recruiting. At the same time, if the cost of keeping an open vacancy is high, be it because the firm is smaller and therefore the span of control of the job posting they're hiring is much higher, or because they're less known, and usually that also correlates with small or perhaps young firms, then we should see for those that hunting for talent is also more profitable. And just a few more comparative statistics that come from our model. If the firm's cost of reviewing applications is very high, we should also expect them to not rely as much as in inbound applications, but proactively look for workers. And the same thing is true and quite trivial. This is not, so this last prediction really doesn't necessarily come from the model, but it is worth mentioning that if there is a decreased cost of acquiring external information on candidates, then of course we should see firms at the margin engaging more in looking for candidates, right? So when I say decreased cost, I mean the availability of platforms such as LinkedIn, or for certain professions, we're talking also about GitHub and other ways to showcase the candidate's abilities in a particular field. So if the cost of looking for those types of information goes down, then we should expect firms to engage more in outbound recruiting. And so how do we take these to the data? Considering the predictions that I told you, we were expecting to see more hunting for talent in sectors where firms need high-skilled individuals, meaning high-skilled workers should be relatively more hunted than non-high-skilled workers. We should also see that smaller firms engage more in hunting for talent in the data. We also expect firms in higher density regions to engage more in hunting for talent, and this has to do with our prediction related to the cost of reviewing internal incoming applications. So if the cost is high in a high density area because you just get a lot more applications, then we should see firms revert to their own means of finding candidates rather than spend so much time looking at inbound applications. And lastly, we also predict that, or we were also expecting that hunting is more prevalent in sectors of the economy where there are abundant online profiles. So this has to do with this idea that if the cost of looking for information on a candidate goes down, then we should see firms engaging more in looking for candidates. And that means sectors where it's easy for me as a worker to showcase my abilities, like, for example, my programming abilities or my career in STEM in general on a platform like LinkedIn. So I will show you the two sets of results that we have for the two sets of data that we used. The first one, as I said, is a survey that we ran roughly a year ago, so end of January 2020. And the survey is a nationally representative sample. To our knowledge, it is the first nationally representative sample that actually includes the question, have you been hunted? We don't exactly ask it like that, but that's the spirit. Have you been hunted by the firm as opposed to sending in an application? And so the question that we ask is, which of the following options best describes how you first got hired by your present employer? And for the sake of comprehensiveness, we try to be as broad as possible. So the first option is, of course, the traditional, I found the job posting and I sent in the application. But we also have options related to referrals, which we know are an important way that the labor market moves in this space. So I was referred by an existing employee. And then we have number 3 and 4, which we use as our measure of hunting for talent, which is a recruiter from this employer reached out to me or a headhunting firm reached out to me. So these 3 and 4 is what we consider our firm-driven search variable. And lastly, we also have, just for the sake of completeness, I reached out to a headhunting firm, which really has very little expression in the data we analyze. So this is the first set of data that we analyze. The second set of data is, of course, as you can see, this is a one-shot survey. We do have a follow-up that maintains the magnitudes of the numbers we find, but we really have no historical or reliable historical perspective. So we try to complement this with burning glass technology data. This gives us two things. One is it gives us more of a history of what has been going on inside firms in terms of their decisions to hire recruiters, but it also gives us exactly the perspective that we're looking for, which is which firms are choosing to engage in active recruiting as opposed to waiting for applications to come in. And so for this, we have a sample of a bit over 160,000 firms over 8 years. So let me show you the results for the survey. The highlight result, which is really the average for the whole sample, is that about 18% of workers as of end of January 2020 got their job through firms driven search. So the firm actively invited them to apply. Now, as I was telling you, we don't really have comparable historical evidence. The closest thing we found, which isn't directly comparable because it was not a nationally representative sample, was from the GSS survey back in 1991, where a similar question was asked in their survey. And the number that came out of that survey was 4.2%. So 4.2% of workers had been hunted, as opposed to what we see now, which is closer to 18%. Even if we take into account that these are directly comparable samples, there is an order of magnitude of difference that really caught our attention. And then the heterogeneity that I mentioned in our predictions is what we find in the data. So the first thing is high-skilled jobs are associated with higher incidence of firm-driven search. And we show this both in education. As you can see, I'm looking at the left set of columns in this graph, so firm-driven search, and it goes from lower attainment, lower education attainment to higher. You can see that the higher educational attainment, the higher the incidence of firm-driven search. Same thing on the income dimension, meaning higher paying jobs are more hunted for. Same thing in the field, meaning more technical skills like STEM skills and even business are considerably more hunted than other fields like social sciences, arts, humanities. And this is the last result I'm going to show you just in the interest of time. We also see that small firms engage more on firm-driven search, and this goes in line with our predictions, meaning that it seems like for firms that are more highly dependent on the job postings that they are searching for, they tend to try to bypass or accelerate the process by hunting for talent. And then I want to show you one last result, and that's it, because according to my timer, I'm getting very close to the 15 minutes. When we go to the burning glass technology data, which give us both a historical perspective, as I told you before, but it also gives us the exactly how firms are looking at this problem, because it is based on firm job postings. We look at HR job postings, and what we see that is really staggering is about a threefold increase in the last 10 years of hiring for HR job postings of professionals that have recruiting skills, meaning they have actively recruited people in the past. And this actually matches quite closely the increase in demand for recruiters with the social media skill, which, after talking to a lot of recruiters in the field, it seems like what that means is recruiters that know how to look for candidates on LinkedIn and GitHub and platforms such as these. So let me conclude by just telling you that in this paper, we provide a theory and descriptive evidence of how the mass availability of information on workers has changed how firms hire, and specifically it has increased their investments in firm-driven search for talent. There is a lot of heterogeneity, of course, across fields, and it seems like high-skilled sectors are still considerably more likely to be hunted. Workers in high-skilled sectors are considerably more likely to be hunted for. This, of course, opens questions about job polarization, which we will leave for another time. And at the same time, we have this interesting evidence that firms have been increasing their capabilities in recruitment, and we don't really expect that to to go away anytime soon. So we're interested to see how this changes over time, but it seems like it's a trend that is here to stay. And that's it. Thank you very much. Sorry if I went a little over time.
Thank you, Ines. Thank you so much. I want to draw your attention to the paper by Deepak and Eunkwang. They have posted a file that you can download. The chat room will disappear after this event. So if you would like to download the file, you need to do that before the chat room closes. All right, Daniel, you are the fourth speaker.
Can you hear me okay? Great. So thank you, Ines. I'm really excited to share this project with you all and continue the conversation from prior presentations. I think there are really interesting connections to be made. And I have to warn you, my project is a little bit more depressing. and I think they will be clear pretty soon. So we've been hearing a lot about American carnage in the past 4 years. And perhaps this is a better picture. But when it comes to American manufacturing employment, carnage captures it just about right. That in the 20 years since 1998, US lost about 5 million jobs in the manufacturing sector, even while the output has consistently grew. And this phenomenon is often called jobless growth. And this precipitous fall is probably the single biggest factor behind America's choice of its 45th president, and has been linked to other serious social consequences, including falling marriage rate, the number of children living under poverty, drug abuse, and even increased incidences of suicide. So I think understanding what's behind this fall has become one of the most pressing questions of our time. So academics differ in their diagnosis, with some pointing to China and others pointing to automation or information technologies that facilitate offshoring to China. But when it comes to a solution, we have this really, really rare agreement among politicians, practitioners, and even academics that we need to accelerate innovation, that it's about sort of picking up our speed is making the technological advances is faster. In this project, I examined whether this innovation-led revival of American manufacturing jobs will work. So a lot of great minds, certainly much greater than mine, have taken a shot at this question. So I thought I'd approach it from a slightly different angle, angle that I know a little bit about. So from the perspective of labor market mobility. But I differ from prior presentations by Ines and Deepak, and in that I'm less interested in hiring, but rather it's flip side, firing. And can innovation save American manufacturing jobs? A short preview? Not really. At least not without making the labor market more flexible and making it easy to fire people. That's the ugly side of labor market, I think. So I think we all agree that innovation is key to economic growth. And today I will follow Thies. I'll be very Thiesian today, hopefully more Thiesian than David Thies himself, and break the innovation process into two subcomponents. Technological invention, followed by commercialization. The distinction, I think, is simple enough. The invention part largely centers around R&D activities and discovering something useful. Patents are probably the most tangible outputs here. Then they must be embedded into a product, manufactured in a large scale, and marketed and distributed. Most of the job creations, at least in terms of headcounts, it's about the manufacturing part. And what's really important here is that there used to be this very tight coupling between invention and post-invention production. So commercializing technological inventions, it's a complex learning process that requires, many annoying rounds of going back and forth between inventors and engineers on the production floor. So even as firms aggressively outsource and offshore more routine activities, think of call centers. So this adjustment requirement rewarded close coordination over access to cheap resources, and kept the investments to commercialize new inventions in the US, and actually typically right across the street in close proximity to the location of the invention, hence the tight coupling. But let me give you an important example of this coupling breaking down. So if everyone could pick up their phone and flip it over, I mean, you're probably seeing this. It's something we see many, many times. Designed by Apple in California, assembled in China. And more generally, invented in US, manufactured someplace else. So it's not really about this part. Although there's so much insecurity about that at the moment, about losing technological leadership to China. And it's certainly happening in some sectors. But if you look at least the number of patents or R&D spending, US inventive activity is doing just fine. It's really about, when it comes to jobless growth, it's really about the failure to convert technological inventions into domestic production. It's about losing that tight coupling. And I'll show you that it has become really difficult to fire people in the US. And it is this rigidity in the labor market that led to the jobless growth, that led to the loss of this tight coupling. And I mean, I don't need to tell this audience that innovation is disruptive and requires a lot of hiring and firing. And I mean, companies before, they co-located invention production because they wanted to go after that rapid coordination and flexible adjustments. But if you take that away by making firing more expensive, farmers are much better off going someplace else. And now that invention and production are decoupled, I mean, it doesn't matter how much we subsidize R&D, how good we are at, how better we become at innovating. It will create a bunch of billionaires, 10 or 20 of them, but it won't create that many jobs. So, I mean, the idea that flexible production is critical to commercializing invention, not exactly revolutionary, not exactly exciting, but turns out separating the two is really difficult because they're interdependent. And I'll tell you shortly how I brilliantly achieved this task that no one has pulled off before. But why is it difficult? So even when you have an exogenous shock that affects the production only and not R&D, the shock ends up traveling upstream and affecting farm R&D activities anyway. So when it becomes more expensive to fire folks, firms redirect their R&D to less disruptive projects, even if they're of lower quality. I mean, we've seen this interdependency under many different names, but Tees calls it co-specialization, where complementary assets specialize to fit invention, and invention specialize to fit complementary assets. So let me very quickly outline the intuition a bit with using a regression specification. So let me start with an exogenous shock on firms' ability to fire people. So for some ugly historical reasons, US maintained a doctrine called employment at will. This basically allowed firms to fire employees at any time without any advance notice. So the firing cost was close to theoretic zero. But starting in the 70s, the state Supreme Courts, so each state have adopted common law exceptions. It's called, the most important one is called implied contract exception, or let me just call them IC for today, that restricted an employer's ability to fire at will and made it much more expensive to fire employees. So IC here is a binary variable set to 1 if a state adopts IC by ERT. And the dependent variable is firm employment growth, measured as year-to-year percentage change in the number of firm employees. And for invention, let me use patent-based proxies of technological invention. So if you look at how invention affects firm growth, you expect beta 1 to be positive, that invention leads to growth. You also expect the interaction between invention and IC, or increased firing cost, to have a negative effect on employment growth. So beta should negatively moderate beta 1. Again, I think that's pretty intuitive enough. But the complication is that IC also ends up affecting invention, the nature of invention. So, I mean, to put in the language of reviewer number 2, our best friend, invention is endogenous to IC. So IC introduces a bias towards incremental inventions that minimize firing costs. So the key challenge here is that we will see that beta 3 is negative, but it's unclear if it's because it's making inventions to be more incremental and of lower quality, or because it decreases the investment in post-invention commercialization. So the decoupling I want to prove. So the challenge is that somehow I need to hold invention as constant as possible and isolate how IC affects the translation of invention production. So let me do that by looking at the unique institutional features of the R&D process. So let me start at the patent level. And I think I will be done in 2 or 3 minutes. So when an inventor first applies for a patent application must provide sufficient detail so that all of the methods needed to practice the invention are well known. It's called a test of enablement. That government will give you monopoly protection, but in exchange, you have to disclose everything about the invention. So if you look at the administrative process of getting a patent and overlaid with the actual underlying inventing, firms are more or less done with the inventing by the time they apply for a patent, because they have to disclose everything. And afterwards, they start working on commercializing them. So depending on when the firm is hit with this employment protection law, or IC, we have 3 categories of shock. We have 3 categories of patents. So first, there are patents that were both applied and issued before IC. And for these patents, IC affected neither R&D nor production. And I think you see where this is going. So for second, there are patents where IC came after the patent application, but before its issuance. And for these patents, IC has little effect on R&D or development, but affects production and production only. And I will call them interim patents. And third, there are patents that are both applied and issued after IC. For these patents, IC affected both the development and the production. So let me call them post. And my entire empirical strategy is it focuses on comparing interim and pre-patents, which allows me to isolate how increased cost of firing affects production and production only. So when I look at how IC affects patent characteristics, let me start with the pre-patents. So for patents that were both applied and granted before IC doesn't affect any of their technological characteristics, how original it is, how novel it is, or how many citations it receives, and also does not affect its market value. For post-patents, of the patents that come after IC decreases originality, novelty, citations, and also the market value by 5.6%. The really interesting part is the interim patents. So the IC doesn't affect any of its technological characteristics, but manages to decrease its market value by 3.7% anyway. So that's the value loss that's coming from being slower in manufacturing and producing the invention. Now on to the real research question. So how does it affect, how does it get to jobless growth? So let me take a very similar empirical approach and look at a short time window immediately after IC adoption. So basically when firms are working to commercialize the interim patents that I just showed you. And so my sample is the universe of US public firms between 1970 and 2000. And I find that a 10% increase in the number of patents increases employment by about 4%. But IC takes away this positive effect by 85%. And the negative effects are driven by fast-moving sectors and that require rapid commercialization, sectors that cannot be readily offshored, and patents that contain radical technologies. I think that's also intuitive. So when I gradually restrict the post window, so once I start my focusing on the interim patents, the effects become larger. But some firms are somehow able to undo this negative effect from IC they're able to undo about half of it over time. And how are they able to undo this? First, I find that firms invest more in capital. So before, when I showed you that this used to be negative for employment, for capital is positive. So we see strong evidence of labor capital substitution. Firms also seem to be going abroad. So now they're offshoring, that they're acquiring a lot more, but entirely in foreign countries. And they're acquiring manufacturing firms. So they seem to be relocating their manufacturing assets from US to some other place. And I find an analogous stronger pattern with respect to JVs. I'll wrap up. So I think that the decoupling is interesting and has many important implications policy-wise and theoretically. But just one point I want to make is that we need to be much more tempered in our belief that technological advances can fix our problems. I think we have this idea that technology will fix a lot of things going forward, but at least they no longer create jobs, even while increasing productivity and firm profits and creating billionaires. And unfortunately, I think so many of our societal problems are coming from the lack of jobs. So thank you. Martin, it's all yours.
All right, thank you very much. So let me share my screen. Okay. Can you guys see my screen? All right, so thank you very much. So thank you for the opportunity to discuss these papers. This was a great, very interesting set of papers. So thank you again, Daniel, for organizing this wonderful symposium. And as I said, it was really a pleasure to read these 4 papers and have the opportunity to discuss them. So I'll start with the first one with Maria, Alex, and I will, sorry, I have a little bit of an issue here. Okay, so so key idea is here to identify the effect of proximity on technological adoption in the context of startup co-working space. So what I liked about this paper, the identification was very, very strong. And if you think about what the kind of the empirical analysis, I think this is really a cutting edge of what's sort of happening in this space. I really like the identification of the threshold distance, which I think was quite unique going back to the prior literature. And of course, the identification comes here from random assignment. So it's very, very tight in terms of the causal effects. So in terms of some comments here, I think there's a lot of work, and of course, I don't know all the details, but there's a lot of work in this space, including the co-authors of this paper. So what I think to me, what is the contribution of this paper is adding more granularity, because you're really carefully identifying that threshold. You have lots of sort of fine level granular data. I wonder if that can be sort of translated into more of a, what is the kind of the theoretical contribution, how that's changing the literature. So right now it's kind of framed as a really an empirical, very important empirical contribution, but I was kind of, it'd be great to really bolster it a little bit more. You have a little bit of that organizational learning connections, but I thought that was not entirely clear to me how that works out, because it's, right, these are very small firms that at the end of the day, it's about the interactions of individuals who are then making decisions as well about what technologies to adopt. So I think the organizational learning element, if you want to go there, it needs to be fleshed out more. What is the organizational learning element of the story? So some empirical comments. I think there's a number of interesting results. For instance, the result about female and how they differ from male interactions are very interesting, because it turns negative. So maybe something can be said there. I also thought about some of these interactions. I think what also could be happening. So of course the treatment is random, but what is at risk? So the technologies that firms have to begin with potentially correlate with how close or far they are from each other. In other words, if you have companies that are very, very close, well, maybe they are also already are using technologies that are very similar. So as a result of that, the likelihood of adopting the partner technology is lower. So I don't think it's really a causal problem. It's just an interpretation of those inverted U-shaped relationships, or what sort of, how we would interpret the results, I think matters. Then when it comes to the instrumented performance results, they're very, very interesting as well. But I was thinking a little bit more about that. I think they matter quite a bit in your results. So I thought, well, maybe what we're seeing here is what is called a heterogeneous response problem, that the people who are exposed, or firms or individuals who are sort of better, unobservably better, are sort of more responsive to these inputs. So if a worse firm exposed to treatment will be less likely to adopt it, and better firm in response to seeing the treatment will be more likely to adopt it. So there still could be something like that going on, especially when it comes to performance regressions. And I think that maybe including some discussion about that would be very helpful. So I would not I don't think you're doing that, but I'll be a little bit more careful about the performance regressions and what we're sort of getting out of this as an instrument, because that heterogeneous response issue could be more pronounced in the context that you have. Other than that, I think it was really cool, very interesting paper. Really like the fine level of analysis, which I think is going beyond the prior work. So yeah, excellent paper. So the next paper, Eunkwang and Deepak. So here, full disclosure, I am on the committee. Okay, I'm on the dissertation committee for Eunkwang. So I'm not an outside observer here, and I have seen this paper before. I provided comments before, and I'm also Illinois alum. So this is connections at multiple levels here. So I kind of will comment here on what is maybe my thoughts about the latest version of the paper, and maybe some suggestions or thoughts. So what I like about this paper, of course, this is very clean, very careful. There's a lot of careful analysis and careful discussion going on. It's also very interesting to think about. The results here are counterintuitive, as Deepak was saying, because we're, prior work sort of think about restrictions on mobility as improving as impeding knowledge flows, and here we kind of see the opposite result. So there's a very interesting sort of theoretical tension here, and it's sort of useful to think about why is that happening, and which contexts are enabling that kind of spillover sort of to occur. What I thought about reading the latest version of the paper is that I think it's maybe a little bit more in the paper than in presentation. There's sort of you hanging your head on one mechanism. Well, there may be other mechanisms as well. And you're talking a lot about the outbound mobility and restrictions, but there's also effect on the inbound mobility, because other firms, if you are using non-competes, that in the focal environment, also other firms are more likely using non-competes, and that can potentially restrict your ability to hire as well. So there's like an inbound effect as well. And I think it goes in the same direction, but it may be helpful to think about that as well. There's also, I think maybe Deepak, you did a nice job discussing sort of the literature, but I think in the paper, I don't think there could be more could be done, sort of building up the tension with prior literature and maybe trying to reconciling it, and more of a, how we seeing the mobility being bad for restricting mobility being bad for spillovers. Here we see the opposite effect. I think that's sort of the punchline of the paper. So maybe that could be brought up a little bit more in the paper. I think the presentation you actually you were doing that. So when it comes to empirics, I think there is also very interesting that we have here the Michigan experiment, and we also have very consistent results using the indexes. And this is right now it's being used as a robustness test, but I thought this could be elevated a lot more, because there's not many papers that have really robust results and are showing full set of results, both sort of the cross-sectional within state comparison using the indexes and Michigan experiment at the same time. So I thought that would be useful to sort of elevate those results more. There's also, I think you talk about it in the paper, there's also this concern that there's something strategic going on about citations, and concern could be that post-Michigan experiment, post-Mara, maybe firms are more careful or more sort of cautious about each other, and they expect more litigation, so they're going to cite each other's patents more as a kind of a defensive strategy. And the way you address it in the paper is that you are taking out examiner-added citations and using these indexes as opposed to just Mara. So I think it works for the robustness test. But again, I think because it's important, I would sort of suggest elevating that more. But overall, yeah, it's a great paper, as all the other papers of Eunkwang's dissertation. And he's an amazing student who's on the market, amazing candidate. So if you guys have job openings, I highly recommend taking a look at his dissertation and job market paper. So a little bit of a plug here. All right, so the third paper, Ines, Sharique, and Rembrandt. So the key idea is here, the high skilled workers, a demand for high skilled workers and lower cost of surge will lead to greater investments in talent surge, which you call the outbound recruitment. And you also build a model and a theory that makes those predictions that Ines was discussing. So what I like here, again, very clear, very careful, very nicely written paper, novel data, great survey. There's also data triangulation. You have multiple sources of data, which you're nicely bringing together. So that's very good. There's also, in terms of my comments on the theory side, there's a little bit of a, so there's a framing in terms of human capital, firm-specific human capital. I thought that could be fleshed out in more detail. If you, again, want to link to that literature more, depends on where you're sending the paper. Same for the model. I thought the model was very nice and very clean, nicely done, but you're almost making the theoretical predictions before the model, and then model kind of comes up with the same set of predictions. So do we need both? Again, it will probably depend on the journal where this is being sent to, but overall it kind of fits nicely together. When reading that paper, I thought what is really interesting is how changing, and I don't think it's really fleshed out in the paper, but maybe that's a paper number 2. I thought it's very interesting to think about how changing the nature of the product market is just changing the demand in the labor market. I think you're touching upon these issues a little bit, but of course, limitations of the data may not allow you to explore all of that. But I thought that's really the fundamentally interesting question. If we have, let's say, more winner takes all markets, or markets which are now more global or more sort of interdependent, that has some implication for how people are recruited. And I thought that's a really interesting tension that could be fleshed out perhaps in future work. There's also a little bit of a size prediction here, which I thought could be, you have it in the data, but it could be maybe theoretically better connected with the others. So right now, as Ines, as you said, this is more of a descriptive focus at this point, which is fine to establish the facts. What I thought is really also interesting, there is the professional headhunting, and if I'm correct, if I'm interpreting the tables correctly, the professional headhunting seems to be driving some of the results in many of the tables. So if you look at just the recruiters reaching out, so those seem to be more stable in some of these tables. And I thought that's an interesting result, and maybe we need to flesh it out more. Why is that the case? And of course, in the lower skills, you will not expect a lot of professional headhunting occurring. Maybe in some of the lower positions, you would not expect a lot of the professional headhunting occurring. So it is in the higher skills. So is that something that maybe would require more discussion or more analysis? What is the relationship between those two categories, because they seem to make a difference. It's not sort of occurring to the same extent in both of the categories for most of these variables that you're looking at, not for all of them. So, and it's the same, how is done in the prior work? Does it, is it the same categories, how they can be, how these things were interpreted in prior work? I thought that would be nice to discuss some of those things in the paper. Second thing is, I think some manipulation checks would be helpful. How did the respondent interpret the difference between referrals and recruiter interactions? Maybe if you have a high skill worker, how did they sort of maybe start with a referral, but then they have more interactions, so how it gets categorized. So some conversation about those type of questions, how people feel about, how people interpret these questions would be helpful. Overall, again, very, very strong paper, very interesting to read. So the last paper, Daniel. So the key idea is we have these implied contract exceptions, legislation made firing costlier, and that is sort of leading to the decoupling of innovation and manufacturing, and sort of led to the offshoring and moving of the facilities abroad. So what I like about this is very comprehensive paper, very, very important implications, as Daniel was showing us with his pictures of Trump at the beginning, which we can all relate to the the tensions and the relief and all of that. So I think what is really interesting here is that it is very, very important question that it's a big question that he's trying to address here, and it has important policy implications. So some comments here. I think because this is a big problem, this is a big question, maybe it's better to start smaller and maybe start sort of piece by piece, as opposed to attacking the whole thing at the same time. I thought there's many moving parts in the paper, so maybe there's like one element and maybe try to pin it down and then move on to the next one. There was also in the paper, there's a lot of discussion about moving from incremental to radical as a result of these IC rulings. That was maybe wasn't entirely clear to me, how those mechanisms sort of play out. On the empirical side, I think the same with the pre-interim post-patent differences. I think I can see where you're going with that, but I think we need more, more explanations. And maybe that's the one piece that you focus on first and sort of flesh it out more. I was also thinking, and this is something which maybe, so there's multiple prior studies that have looked at these IC adoption as exogenous. But I could also imagine a sort of a situation in which you have people getting fired and plants are being closed. And that, as a result of that, we're getting lawsuits in the state, and then it bubbles up to the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court makes some sort of ruling. So maybe this has been addressed in prior work, but I thought the assumption of exogeneity, because of the nature of your analysis in your context, requires a lot more thought. Is it really exogenous? You need to get deeper into the processes within these states, because I think the reverse channel is very plausible as well, right? It's the offshoring, it's the closures, it's the people getting fired, which actually is causing some of the adoption of these rulings. And maybe not, but I think that sort of requires more discussion there. Overall, again, very, very cool, very important. Really enjoyed reading it. So thank you very much. This is all from me.
Thank you, Martin. Well, we are just 1 minute away from our allotted time this session. So I would encourage you all to reach out to the authors if you would like to continue the discussion. And so we don't have any room for Q&A, but there was quite a bit of exchanges on the chat room. So last chance to download anything from the chat room if you want. Otherwise, join me to thank our presenters today. Thank you all. We will see you at the next STR event. Bye now.